Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever felt that something in your home is wrong, even though everything looks perfectly normal? Something that you can't quite put your finger on, but it's there, lurking in the background, waiting? For me, that something has always been the room. The one room in my house that's always been off limits, an old, dusty guest room with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of something that I couldn't quite place. I never thought much of it when I moved in, just a forgotten part of the house. But over time, I started hearing stories, strange rumors about that room. They all said the same thing: no one sleeps in that room. They said it was cursed. At first, I dismissed it as local superstition, just a silly myth. After all, I had lived in the house for months and nothing had happened. But then I started hearing whispers. At night, when I was alone, I could hear them, soft voices, like faint murmurs, coming from the direction of that room. Sometimes, when I passed by the door, I could swear I saw something move behind it. A shadow. A figure. I tried to ignore it. The rational part of me told me it was just my imagination. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That room was alive in a way that the rest of the house wasn't. I didn't want to believe it, but part of me knew something had happened in that room. Something I wasn't supposed to know. Something that could not be undone. Then, one evening, everything changed. A friend of mine, Peter, came to visit. He had been through a rough time, lost his job, his girlfriend, and had nowhere else to go. I offered him the spare room, but when he saw the door to the guest room, his face went pale. He hesitated for a moment, looking at me as if trying to decide whether to say something. "Is there something wrong with that room?" he asked. His voice was tight, as if he was trying to hide his fear. I laughed it off, just like I had done before. "No, nothing at all. It's just a room, Peter. Don't let the rumors get to you." He didn't seem convinced, but eventually he agreed. I led him to the room and opened the door. The air inside felt different, cooler, almost stagnant, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But Peter didn't seem to notice. He thanked me and set his things down on the bed. That night, after a long day of talking and catching up, Peter retired to the guest room. He was tired, and I was relieved that he seemed to be settling in. But as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. The house was quieter than usual. Too quiet. I sat in my living room, the silence pressing down on me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, faint noises coming from the hallway. But each time I checked, I found nothing. Hours passed, and I was about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a soft creak, followed by a muffled thud. It came from the guest room. My heart stopped. I stood up, frozen for a moment, unsure whether I should investigate. But then, the silence broke again, this time with a loud crash. "Peter?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" There was no response. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the door of the guest room. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, my breath shallow, every instinct telling me not to open it. But I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at me. The feeling that something was wrong. very wrong. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. I could barely make out the shape of the bed, the lump beneath the covers. But there was something off about the scene, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Peter was lying still on the bed, his face pale and his eyes wide open. His body was stiff, like a mannequin, but he wasn't moving. "Peter?" I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "Peter, wake up." But no response came. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, staring straight ahead as though seeing something I couldn't. Then I heard it, the faintest of whispers. A voice, low and indistinct, coming from the direction of the bed. It wasn't Peter's voice. It was something else, something unnatural. I felt the air grow colder, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if it was calling me, beckoning me closer. My feet moved on their own, my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. I reached out and touched Peter's arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold. As if his body had been lying there for hours, maybe days, even though I knew he had only just laid down. "Peter, please," I whispered, but my voice cracked. And then, suddenly, Peter's head jerked to the side, his eyes snapping towards me. They were no longer the warm, familiar eyes of my friend. They were empty, hollow, filled with darkness. His mouth opened, but instead of speaking, a soundless scream erupted from his throat, a scream that tore through the silence of the room, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What was happening? Why was it doing this? Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then I heard it, the faintest of whispers again, but this time it was clear. "Now it's your turn." The door wouldn't open. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls growing tighter with every breath. I turned toward the bed, but Peter, whatever it was, wasn't there anymore. I could feel something moving in the dark, slowly closing in on me. Something ombre. Something that only came when you slept. And that was when I realized. The rumors were true. The room wasn't just cursed. It was feeding. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, hands shaking. The room was suffocating, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like the floor was made of stone, like I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. I didn't know if I was frozen in place by fear or by something else entirely. That whisper, the voice that echoed in my ears, "Now it's your turn," continued to reverberate in my mind. It was more than just a sound. It was a presence. A feeling. A thing that knew me, that wanted me. I forced myself to move, to back away from the bed. But the room wasn't the same anymore. The walls felt as though they were closing in on me, pressing down, trapping me inside with something that wasn't human, something that wasn't even alive in the way I understood. And then, the temperature dropped. I could feel it, the air around me becoming frigid, too cold for comfort. My breath came out in a visible puff, a cloud of vapor in the stillness. The cold didn't make sense. It wasn't coming from the window, which was tightly shut. It wasn't natural. It was as if the room itself had become a thing, a living, breathing thing that had suddenly turned hostile. I stumbled backward and reached for the door again, but my hands were trembling too much to turn the knob. That's when I heard it, the soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It wasn't from the bed this time. It was coming from the far corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner, dreading what I might see. But all I could make out was darkness. Thick, suffocating darkness that swallowed everything in its path. And then the scraping stopped. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. My pulse raced in my ears. What was that? I couldn't let myself think too much about it. I had to leave. I had to get out of that room before whatever it was came closer. With a final burst of adrenaline, I yanked the door open. The hallway was dark, but there was no time to hesitate. I turned to run, but as my foot touched the floor of the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me, locking itself with a loud click. My eyes widened in shock. I twisted the doorknob frantically, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was refusing to let me leave. Please, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. Please, let me out. But there was no answer. No sound, no sign of anything moving, just the thick silence pressing in around me. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall across the hallway. The fear, the dread, it was all consuming, tightening like a vice around my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the presence of something watching me. Something hungry. And then I heard the sound again, the scraping, this time closer, sharper, as if something was dragging its nails along the walls. Slowly, the sound grew louder, and I could feel the floor beneath me vibrate with every movement. I wasn't alone. I turned, my eyes scanning the hallway, the stairs, but there was nothing there. The house was still. Silent. It wasn't until I looked back at the guest room that I saw it. A shadow had moved. A figure stood in the doorway, half obscured by the darkness, but I could see the shape. The outline of a person, or something trying to look like a person. It wasn't Peter. The figure didn't move. It just watched. It stood there, as still as the air around us. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, drilling into me, searching. It was a feeling I could never forget, the sensation that this thing knew my deepest fears, my darkest secrets, and it was savoring them. My legs went weak. I had no choice. I turned and ran, not caring about where I was going, just needing to get away from that room, from whatever that thing was. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps loud in the silence of the house. The stairs creaked under my weight, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get out. The door to the outside was right in front of me. I reached for the knob and pulled, but it didn't open. My heart stopped in my chest. I tried again, yanking at the handle with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. No. No, no, no. I ran to the back door. Locked. The kitchen window? Closed. Every exit I tried was sealed, as if the house itself had turned against me, trapping me inside with whatever had been hiding in the guest room. I had nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were in my head, crawling into my mind. They were calling me, begging me to return to the room. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Whatever it was coming closer. I could feel it. I could feel it in my bones. And then I heard a sound behind me. The soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. I froze, slowly turning my head. There, at the top of the stairs, stood Peter, or at least, what had once been Peter. His eyes were wide open, empty and hollow, just like before. His mouth was stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. The same grin I had seen earlier when he had screamed. "It's your turn now," he whispered, the words barely audible. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't escaping. The house wasn't going to let me. I wasn't going anywhere. My heart thundered in my chest as Peter's shadowed figure stood motionless at the top of the stairs, just staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no life, just an emptiness that sent chills straight through me. The twisted grin on his face remained unsettlingly wide and unnatural. "Peter?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath, but he didn't respond. I could feel the air in the hallway grow heavier, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The walls seemed to close in, the space shrinking around us as though the house itself was alive and feeding on the terror pulsing through me. Slowly, I took a step back, but the floor creaked beneath me, and Peter's head snapped toward the sound, his grin widening in a way that made my stomach churn. I froze. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. The words seemed to come from all directions, filling the entire house. My name. The same words over and over. "Come back. It's time." I felt a pull, an invisible force dragging me towards the stairs, urging me to follow. My legs refused to move, but my mind was no longer in control. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face whatever waited for me, but my body betrayed me. Slowly, my feet began to move, one step at a time, as if I was being guided by an unseen hand. My eyes never left Peter's vacant stare as I ascended the stairs, the thudding of my heartbeat loud in my ears. When I reached the top, I felt a coldness sweep over me. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something darker, a presence that pressed against my skin, clinging to me like a cold, damp fog. I wanted to turn around, to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't stop myself. Peter didn't move. He remained there, watching me, his grin never fading. But I felt a shift in the atmosphere. Something was changing. Something was moving, slowly, quietly, like a shadow lurking in the corner of the room. The door to the guest room stood ajar, the dim light from the hallway barely reaching inside. I could see the bed, still and undisturbed, but something was off. Something wasn't right. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, swirling around me in a maddening chorus. It was as though the house was alive, breathing, feeding off my fear. "It's too late now," the voice said, low and mocking. "You can't leave." I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. My feet were planted to the floor, my body paralyzed by the weight of the presence in the room. The door creaked open, the sound of the hinges groaning in protest, and I knew I had no choice but to go inside. I stepped forward, my body moving against my will. The darkness beyond the door swallowed me whole. Inside, the air was thick with an unnatural cold. The walls seemed to close in tighter as I moved further into the room. The bed was now alive, the covers twisted and shifting, like something moving underneath them. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from beneath the bed, rattling the floorboards. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of something heavy, something dark, pressing down on me, suffocating me. A dark shape moved beneath the bed, its outline barely visible. It was there, watching me. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said again, now unmistakably inside my head. You woke it up. The covers of the bed suddenly flew back, and I was hit with the overwhelming stench of rot, of something dead that had been there far too long. I stumbled backward, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room with whatever it was. The shape beneath the bed slowly began to rise. It was hunched over, its limbs too long, too distorted, bending at unnatural angles. Its face was a blur of shadow, no eyes, no mouth, just a vague, terrifying mass of dark, shifting nothingness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me, and I could only watch as the creature rose higher, its form becoming clearer with each agonizing second. It was coming for me. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed by invisible hands. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my throat dry and tight. The creature, no longer just a shadow, now stood before me. It was enormous, towering over me, its presence suffocating. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel it inside my head, reaching into the deepest parts of my mind, pulling at my memories, my fears, my dreams. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but it was no use. The thing knew me. It knew my fears, my nightmares. And it was hungry. I could feel my own consciousness slipping, like I was being pulled into something dark and endless. The room was no longer just a room, it was a prison, a place where my thoughts and dreams were being devoured. I tried to scream again, but the words never came. The creature moved closer, its dark, featureless face now inches from mine. It exhaled, a cold, hollow breath that rattled my bones. Sleep now, it whispered, and I felt everything around me begin to fade. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't let it win. I fought back, tried to push it out, but the darkness was too strong. And then, just as I thought I had lost, something inside me broke free. A flash of light. A memory. A scream. And then everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, my lungs burning, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, the weight of the nightmare clinging to me like a second skin. But it felt wrong. Too wrong. The room was dim, the early morning light just beginning to filter through the curtains. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. The air still felt thick, charged with a strange energy I couldn't explain. My heart was still racing, but I wasn't sure if it was from the dream or something else. I looked around the room. Everything appeared normal, as it should be. But I felt watched. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if the danger had passed. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking. The time on the screen read 6:13 a.m. But I had no memory of how I had gotten back to bed. I glanced at the door, half expecting to see Peter standing in the hallway, waiting for me. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just the stillness of my house. I pushed myself off the bed, my legs weak beneath me. As I stood, I felt the familiar pull, the strange, suffocating presence that had haunted me the night before. It was in the air. It was everywhere. My body was moving on its own, like I was being guided, or worse, controlled. I stumbled toward the door, not entirely sure if I wanted to open it. But my hand reached for the handle before I could stop it. The moment I touched it, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, just a small click, but then it grew louder, like footsteps, coming closer. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, expecting to see Peter again or something far worse. But nothing. Only the soft, hollow click of a door closing somewhere far in the house. I took a step back. The house seemed bigger now, more oppressive. The walls felt like they were closing in again, but it was worse. Much worse. The air was alive with something, a presence that I couldn't see but could feel. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned to face the stairs again. The staircase stretched before me like a dark tunnel, a path I had already walked down once, but this time it felt like a descent into madness. The door to the guest room at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar, the darkness inside pulling me, whispering my name. I had to know. I had to confront whatever it was. Slowly, carefully, I moved toward the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out like fingers trying to grab me, pull me back into the dark. When I reached the top, I didn't hesitate. I walked toward the door, my breath shallow, my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. It was as if something deep inside me had already made the decision, and I was only a passenger along for the ride. I pushed the door open with a creak, the sound almost deafening in the oppressive silence. The room was just as it had been the night before, except now, it felt alive. The air was thick with a cold mist, swirling around the room like smoke. The bed was empty, but the covers were tangled, twisted in a way that didn't make sense. I stepped further inside, my eyes darting around the room. The floorboards creaked beneath me, the sound amplified in the silence. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. A feeling. A presence. And then I heard it. A low, faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tensing. It was Peter. Or, at least, it looked like him. His body was hunched, his face hidden in the shadows, but I could hear his breath, deep and labored. His voice, when it came, was a rasping whisper. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. I took a step backward, but then stopped myself. This wasn't Peter anymore. It couldn't be. The voice wasn't his. It was something other. Something twisted, dark. The room began to feel smaller again, the walls pressing in around me, the shadows growing longer, swallowing the space. The whispering intensified, the sound bouncing off the walls, surrounding me. The creature that had taken Peter, or maybe had always been Peter, moved closer. His head snapped up to look at me, his eyes wide and empty. But they weren't eyes anymore. They were dark, hollow sockets, like deep holes that sucked in all light. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, my body trembling with fear. The thing, that creature, stepped toward me, its limbs moving unnaturally, jerking with each step. It was growing larger, expanding, until it seemed to fill the entire room. The space was gone. There was only it, closing in. "Sleep," it said. "Sleep and dream, forever." I could feel it now, its presence invading my thoughts, dragging me into its darkness. The shadows seemed to take shape, twisting and stretching, becoming fingers, arms, bodies reaching out to claim me. I tried to break free, but my body wouldn't respond. My mind was being clouded, consumed by a cold, suffocating fog. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my chest, but it was drowning beneath the whispers. The whispers, they were calling me, pulling me deeper. And then I heard it clearly. Sleep now. The words were soft, soothing, wrong. And with that final whisper, everything went black. I woke up, again, gasping for air. But this time, it was different. The room wasn't dark. There was no oppressive fog or whispering shadows. It felt too bright, too ordinary. The smell of fresh sheets and the faint scent of coffee filled the air, but something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat up, eyes darting around the room. It was my room, yes. The familiar walls, the bed I had slept in countless times before. But there was a sense of alienness to everything now. A lingering presence. I could still feel it, lurking at the edge of my awareness. I couldn't remember how I had gotten back into bed. I couldn't remember how long I had been asleep. My mind was foggy, as though it was struggling to break through some unseen barrier. I touched my head, running my fingers through my hair. The cold sweat from before had dried, but my body was still tense. Something told me this wasn't over. Something told me that the worst was still yet to come. I looked at the clock. The time read 7:22 a.m. Just an hour had passed since I'd last checked. An hour, but it felt like so much more. It felt like days. Years. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, forcing myself to stand. The air in the room felt thick, like it was closing in on me. My mind screamed for me to leave, to escape, but I didn't know where I could go. The thing in the guest room, whatever it was, still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't let go of the image of its hollow, lifeless eyes. And then I heard it. A faint whisper. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A voice, like the one from the room. Sleep. It was too soft to be real. Too soft to be coming from anyone or anything alive. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source. Nothing. The room was still. Too still. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door, my hand reaching for the knob. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. But the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Sleep now. I jerked my hand away from the doorknob, my heart racing again. The voice was in my head, its presence suffocating me, drowning out everything else. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy, like the creature from before was pulling at my thoughts. No, I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. No more. I won't sleep. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent. Sleep and dream, forever. I tried to fight it, tried to push the words out of my mind, but they wouldn't leave. They were inside me, burrowing deep, like seeds planted in my thoughts. I could feel myself weakening, my resistance breaking down as I stepped back from the door. It was happening again. The thing, whatever it was coming for me. It had found me. It would never let me go. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend, warping around me like the room itself was alive, pressing in on me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, dark and shifting, lurking at the edge of the room. A silhouette that didn't belong. Then, it stepped into the light. It was Peter, or at least, it looked like him. His features were twisted, wrong, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. His eyes were dark, his skin pale, but it was the way he moved that made my blood run cold. slow, jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, raspier, unnatural. "Sleep now." He took a step forward, then another. I backed away, my legs unsteady. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped inside. "No," I gasped, my body shaking with fear. "You're not Peter. You're not real." His lips twisted into something resembling a smile, if you could even call it that, and for a moment, I almost believed him. Almost. He stepped closer, his presence like a weight pressing against me. "Sleep." And then, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, I understood. It wasn't just Peter. It wasn't just a creature feeding on my fear, on my dreams. It was something older. Something that had always been there, hidden in the folds of reality. It was the thing in the room, in the house. The thing that was pulling the strings, making everything happen. It was feeding on me. On my dreams. My fear. My pain. The creature was alive, and it had no intention of letting me go. I felt myself slipping, my will crumbling beneath the weight of its presence. I stumbled backward, my head spinning, and now was when I saw it. The bed. The bed that had been my sanctuary. The bed that had always been the last thing I saw before falling into sleep. But now it wasn't a safe haven. It wasn't anything but a trap. A trap for my mind, for my soul. The room was collapsing around me. The air was thick, the shadows swirling, taking form. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only hear that whisper. Over and over. Always. Sleep. I didn't want to give in. I didn't want to be consumed. But as I felt my body grow heavy, as my eyelids fluttered and my thoughts began to fragment, I knew the price of sleep. And I knew that I was about to pay it. I had always been alone in this apartment. It wasn't a bad place, just small and quiet. But something about it felt off. I didn't know it exactly. Maybe it was the way the light never quite seemed to reach the corners of the rooms, or the shadows that lingered too long. But mostly, it was the silence. Silence that stretched on for days, weeks, months. It had become a part of the apartment, almost like an unspoken rule. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, I heard it. A faint sound, barely perceptible at first. It came from the vent above the stove. I stopped reading and strained my ears, listening closely. It sounded like a whisper, just a soft, breathy noise. It was too quiet to make out, but I could tell it wasn't normal. The house was quiet, too quiet, and yet there it was. I shrugged it off. It was probably the wind. Maybe something had shifted in the building. But as I went back to my book, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whisper had sounded almost intentional, like it was meant for me. My mind started to race, thinking of all the logical explanations. Maybe it was the air ducts. Maybe the building had settled, and it was just a weird sound traveling through the walls. But then, it came again. This time, louder. A low, soft murmur that seemed to curl around my ears like a snake. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up and walked over to the vent, my heart beating faster. I stared at it for a few moments, waiting. But nothing happened. Just the usual hum of the building. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. The building was old, and old buildings made strange noises. Still, I couldn't help but feel an unease settle in my stomach. Something about that whisper felt wrong. I shook my head. It was ridiculous. I had to get some sleep. But as I lay in bed, trying to drift off, I heard it again. This time, the whisper was clearer. Come closer. I froze. The words were unmistakable. I lay there, motionless, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? The whispers seemed to echo in my ears, distant and close all at once. I could feel my pulse quicken, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to go near the vent. But something told me I had to. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone from the bedside table. Maybe if I recorded it, I could prove to myself that it wasn't just my imagination. I hit record, holding the phone up to the vent. My fingers were trembling, and I could barely steady my hand. The room was silent. Too silent. My own breath sounded deafening in my ears. I waited and waited, hoping to hear it again. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own heart beating wildly in my chest. I sat down on the floor, staring at the vent, my mind racing. Could this really be happening? Was I losing my mind? Then it came again. A whisper, soft at first, then louder, clearer, come closer. I jumped back, dropping my phone in the process. My chest felt tight, and I could hardly breathe. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, oppressive. I grabbed the phone, heart still racing, and turned it off. No more recordings. No more trying to understand what was happening. I had to get out of there. But as I stood to leave, something caught my eye. A shadow. A shadow that wasn't mine. It flickered across the wall, just for a moment, and then was gone. I froze. The room felt colder now, and I could hear the whispering again, but it was different. The sound was no longer just a whisper, it was a presence. A presence that filled the room with a weight I couldn't escape. I wasn't alone anymore. And whatever it was watching me. I didn't know what to do. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave, to escape the apartment, but the front door felt like miles away. I was paralyzed, standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the walls, the floor, the vent. All I could think about was the whisper. The presence. The shadow. I moved slowly, almost in a trance, towards the vent. The silence in the room was suffocating, and I felt as though the walls were closing in on me. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I placed them against the cold metal. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel it, like a pressure on the back of my neck, like someone was just behind me, waiting. I pulled my hand away from the vent, breathing shallowly, and stumbled backwards, looking around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything looked normal. But that whisper, those words, kept playing over and over in my mind, come closer. I needed answers. Maybe it was something simple, like a mechanical malfunction, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. This felt too real, too personal. I grabbed my phone again, hands still shaking, and opened the camera. I hesitated for a moment, then began recording the vent, hoping to capture anything strange. The room felt colder now. The air had a heaviness to it, like the oxygen was being sucked out of the space, and I felt my breath coming out in slow, labored gasps. The shadows seemed to stretch, warping against the walls, and I could swear the edges of the room were getting darker. The vent hissed softly. It was like a soft exhale, just barely audible, but there. I felt my chest tighten. It was coming from inside the vent. The whispers, no, not whispers anymore, sounded like faint voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to echo, not just in the room, but through the walls, in the floors, the ceilings. I turned quickly, my gaze scanning the apartment. It was as if I could hear them moving through the walls, the whispers shifting, now distant, now close again. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but when I turned, there was no one there. A voice, clear this time, cut through the air. You need to open the door. I froze. The words rang in my ears, louder than the last. Open the door. To what? To them? To whatever was hiding behind the walls? I felt sick to my stomach, my knees going weak. I couldn't stay here. But I couldn't leave either, not without understanding what was happening. I grabbed the nearest chair, my hand clenched tightly around its back, and dragged it over to the vent. I climbed up, standing on it to get a better look. I stared into the dark metal opening, my heart pounding. Nothing but darkness. But then, a faint, flickering light appeared deep inside the vent. It was like the glow of a distant fire, pulsing in time with the whispering. I could almost see shapes moving, shapes that weren't quite human, not quite anything I recognized. They were like shadows, but more than shadows. They seemed to distort the air around them, warping it, making everything shimmer and bend. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The voices had stopped, replaced by a horrible, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floors. A low growl. A hum. The shadows inside the vent moved again, but now they were closer, growing larger. And then, they stopped. Everything fell silent. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I had gone mad. But then I heard it again. Clearer this time. A soft whisper. Let us in. The words sent a chill through my entire body. The voices were no longer just whispers, they were demands. They weren't asking me to come closer anymore. They were telling me to open the door. Let them in. But I couldn't. I couldn't do that. I turned, desperately searching for an escape. There had to be a way out, a way to stop whatever this was from getting worse. But the door, it felt like it was closing in on me. The walls pressed in tighter, the shadows growing thicker. The growling sound came again, this time closer, and I stumbled backwards, my heart racing. I turned toward the door, toward the exit, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the apartment had become a trap, and I was its prey. And then, just as I was about to run, I heard it again. Not from the vent. From behind me. Don't leave. The voice was clearer now, like a breath against my ear, and I spun around, but there was no one there. No one except the shadows. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to find a way out. But as I turned toward the door, I saw it. A figure. Standing in the hallway. It was barely a silhouette, but its eyes, those eyes, were glowing. It was waiting. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding violently in my chest. The figure in the hallway was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the faint light from the kitchen. But I could feel it. I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to move, to scream, but my body betrayed me. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and no sound escaped my mouth, no matter how hard I tried to scream. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Its eyes, those eyes, were glowing. The light was faint, but unmistakable. The glow was unnatural, an eerie, almost sickly greenish hue that made my stomach turn. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. I thought it was some trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering lamp in the living room. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. This wasn't just a shadow. It was real. It was here. I had to move. I had to get out. I forced my legs to move, taking a step back, but the figure didn't shift. It didn't take a step toward me. It just stood there, blocking the hallway, blocking the only exit from the apartment. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my chest tightening, as if the very air around me was becoming thicker, heavier. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please let me go." But the figure didn't respond. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was clear. I turned toward the vent, my gaze flicking back and forth between the figure and the dark, metal opening. The whispers had started again, soft and distant, but now they seemed to be coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. The shadows had grown more pronounced, stretching out from the corners like fingers, reaching toward me. I had to leave. I had to do something. Anything. I rushed toward the door, my feet pounding against the floor as I stumbled toward the exit. But as I reached for the handle, the whispers grew louder, the sound filling my ears. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a scream. A low, guttural scream, almost like a wind howling through the cracks in the walls. The door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I pulled harder, yanked at the handle with all my strength, but it was no use. The door was stuck. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and I could feel something behind me, something moving closer. The figure in the hallway remained motionless, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I turned, desperate to find something, anything, that could help me escape. But the apartment seemed to close in on me. The walls were narrowing, the shadows growing thicker. The air was colder now, and the light from the kitchen had faded into a dim, sickly glow. And then I heard it again. A voice. Not from the figure. Not from the vent. But from inside my own mind. "Open the door. Let us in." The words were soft, but they felt like a command, a demand. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle once more, but this time I didn't pull. I hesitated, the voice in my head urging me forward. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to let them in. But the whispering continued, the voices swirling around me, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. The growl from the vent, the low hum in the walls, the flickering light in the kitchen. They were all merging into one. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't stand it any longer. The pressure, the suffocating silence, the way the shadows pressed in on me from every direction. I felt like I was losing myself, losing my grip on reality. With trembling hands, I turned the handle. The door opened with a low creak, and for a moment, everything was still. Silent. The whispering had stopped. The growl had stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it. The presence, the thing waiting behind the door, was still there. It had always been there. The hallway beyond the door was dark, colder than anything I had ever felt before. The shadows seemed to stretch impossibly far, like they were alive, like they were waiting for me to step into them. And then I heard it. A low, rasping breath. It came from the shadows, from the darkness just beyond the door. Come closer. I stepped forward, slowly, hesitantly. But as soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound of the wood hitting the frame echoing through the apartment. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no way back. The apartment was gone. The vent, the shadows, the figure, they were all behind me now. And the hallway was endless. I could hear them, the whispers, the demands, coming from everywhere. Behind the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive, as if it was reaching for me, pulling me deeper into it. I was no longer alone, and I had just walked into their world. I couldn't breathe. The hallway stretched before me, endless and dark, the air thick and cold. The whispers had returned, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus of them, all calling to me, urging me to move forward, urging me to come closer. The walls seemed to shift, bending and warping, as though they were made of something fluid, something that could change at will. The floor beneath my feet groaned, and I could feel the building itself shifting, adjusting to some unseen force. I took a step forward, my body moving on its own, like I had no control. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, as if they were inside my head. Come closer. Let us show you. Let us in. The voices were so familiar now, so personal. It was as if they knew me, knew my every fear, my every secret. The hallway seemed to grow darker the farther I went. The faint light that had been at the threshold of the door was now gone, swallowed by the shadows. My eyes strained, but I couldn't make out anything ahead of me. Just a void, an endless void, stretching into infinity. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead of me. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shape, a silhouette, blending into the dark like one of the shadows themselves. But as I stepped closer, the figure took shape. It was humanoid, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too unnaturally elongated. Its face was obscured in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, two bright, glowing orbs, staring directly at me with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thundering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting, as though it had been expecting me all along. And then, a voice. A cold, chilling whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the darkness itself. You should have listened. The words were like a punch to my gut. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. The whispers around me had stopped for a moment, replaced by an overwhelming silence. But that silence was worse. It felt like something was building, something that I couldn't see, but I could feel closing in on me. Let us in, the voice said again, clearer this time. You have no choice. I spun around, looking for any way out, but the hallway was still endless. The door, the one I had come through, was gone. There was no escape. I ran. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, but no matter how fast I moved, the darkness seemed to stretch further, pulling me back in. The whispers followed me, louder now, a cacophony of voices all clamoring for attention, all demanding that I listen, that I come closer. I turned another corner, but the hallway only continued, twisting and bending as though it had no end. My chest ached with each breath, my legs growing weaker with every step. I had to stop. I had to rest. But then, I saw something. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. A door that hadn't been there before. It stood out against the darkness, its edges glowing faintly, as if it were made of some sort of ethereal light. I stumbled toward it, hope flaring up inside me. Maybe this was the way out. Maybe this was the escape I'd been searching for. But as I reached for the door handle, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was cold. So cold. I froze, my entire body stiffening in fear. The hand didn't move, didn't squeeze or push, it just rested there, cold and unnatural, as if it didn't belong to anything human. The voice, that same voice, spoke again. This time, it was not a whisper. It was clear, sharp, and full of malice. You can't leave. I turned slowly, and standing behind me, just inches away, was the figure I had seen earlier. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. You were always meant to be here, it said, its voice low and echoing. We've been waiting for you. Terror shot through me like a jolt of electricity. I tried to back away, but the figure's hand was still on my shoulder, holding me in place. The hallway, the darkness, it all seemed to close in on me, pulling tighter and tighter, until there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You opened the door, the figure whispered, its voice like a cold breeze. Now you're part of this place. Part of us. I could feel it, this place was alive. It was alive, and it was feeding on my fear. The walls, the shadows, the vent, the voices, they were all part of it. And now, so was I. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence around me. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers cold and unyielding. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the whispers stopped. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence I had known before. This silence was thick, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. The figure let go of my shoulder, and I turned to face it. Its eyes, glowing with that sickly light, stared back at me. You're not alone anymore, it said softly, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, it added, we're always watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words felt heavy on my tongue. It was as if the very air was against me, suffocating me, stealing my will. And I understood then. I was trapped. Forever. The door was still there, still glowing faintly, but it wasn't an escape. It was just another part of the labyrinth. I had walked into their world. And now, I would never leave. The silence suffocated me, the weight of it pressing in from every angle. The figure in front of me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine, stood still as a statue, its presence looming, suffocating. I could feel my mind unraveling, the walls of reality crumbling around me. The whispers had ceased, but I could still hear them inside my head, echoing, a chorus of voices, soft yet unrelenting. We're here, the figure whispered, its voice like ice scraping against bone. We've always been here. I stumbled backward, shaking my head in disbelief. My mind screamed at me to run, to find a way out, but my legs felt as though they were made of lead. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the walls closing in tighter with every breath. The door, the glowing door, was still at the far end, but now it seemed unreachable. The darkness between me and it was like an ocean, too vast to cross. You think you can leave? The figure stepped closer, its voice low, almost affectionate. You think you can escape us? I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. I was trapped. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This place wasn't just an apartment. It wasn't just a hallway. It was something else. Something alive. And it had been waiting for me. The floor beneath my feet groaned, the shadows curling and twisting like living things, moving closer, reaching out for me. The temperature in the hallway dropped even further, and I felt the chill deep in my bones, a cold that sank past the skin, past the flesh, straight into my soul. I looked back at the door, my last hope, and it flickered. The faint glow that had surrounded it was flickering now, like a dying light bulb. But the figure, whatever it was, sensed my gaze and stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the door entirely. That's not for you, it said softly, its voice almost tender. That door leads nowhere. Just like your escape. I felt the weight of its words, and something in me broke. I had been searching for an escape, for a way out of this nightmare. But now I realized something. There was no escape. There never had been. The figure tilted its head, as if it was studying me, observing my fear. Its smile, or what I assumed was a smile, was wide, its teeth sharp and jagged, glistening in the dim light. The eyes, those glowing eyes, held me captive. I couldn't look away. It was like they were pulling me in, drowning me in their light. You see, the figure whispered, you're a part of us now. We've been waiting for someone like you. Someone willing to open the door. Someone curious. I shook my head, fighting the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. I had to stay strong. I had to find a way out. But the whispers came again, louder this time. They weren't just in my mind anymore. They were in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around me. Thousands of voices, each one distinct, each one pleading, demanding. Let us in. Come closer. Don't leave us. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I felt my knees buckling, my legs giving out beneath me. I dropped to the floor, gasping for air, feeling the cold seeping into my skin. The figure didn't move. It stood there, watching me, its eyes glowing brighter as I sank lower. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The shadows were swallowing me whole, pulling me down, down into the floor, into the walls, into the very essence of this place. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, a voice, clearer than all the others, broke through. You'll never be alone again. It was a promise. A threat. I looked up, through blurred vision, and saw the figure's eyes, now two burning orbs of light, staring into my soul. And then, the whisper came again. Louder. More forceful. More demanding. Let us in. I felt something inside me snap. I knew what was happening. I knew what I had to do. I pushed myself up, using every ounce of strength left in my body, and I ran. I ran for the door, my feet slipping against the cold floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea if it would lead to safety, but it was the only chance I had left. The darkness, the whispers, the figure, they were all behind me, closing in fast. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the shadows reaching for me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the door. And then, just as my hand touched the handle, everything went black. The last thing I heard was the faintest whisper, not from the figure, but from deep within the walls, from somewhere far beyond this place. You belong to us now. And I knew, without a doubt, that it was true. I woke up. But nothing felt real anymore. The shadows still lingered. The whispers still echoed in my mind. And the door that I had thought would lead to escape, was still there. But I wasn't sure if it would ever open again. I wasn't sure if I would ever leave. I wasn't sure if I had ever left. Have you ever heard a noise that you couldn't explain? Something so distant, so unnatural, that it sends a cold shiver down your spine but also makes you question your own sanity? What if I told you that the sound wasn't just some figment of your imagination, but a warning? I never believed in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. I was just a night guard at a construction site, a job I took after getting laid off from the factory. Nothing special. The building was a mess, partly constructed, then abandoned years ago when the developers ran out of money. It wasn't even a place you'd walk past without wondering what happened to it. Piles of concrete and rusted metal, half-built walls that reached toward the sky as if trying to escape the earth itself. It was the perfect job for someone like me, isolated, quiet, nothing to worry about but the occasional homeless person trying to sneak in. I sat in my little office, sipping coffee and reading old magazines. Most nights, it was uneventful, just the hum of the city outside, the soft buzz of the flickering lights above me. But that night changed everything. It started with a thud. I was halfway through my shift when I first heard it, a faint, dull thud, like something heavy being dropped far below the ground. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, an old foundation shifting under its own weight. But then it came again. Thud. 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 The sound was coming from beneath the concrete floor. I stood up, my boots scraping against the linoleum as I made my way to the window, peering out into the dark expanse of the construction site. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. The thud came again, louder this time, more distinct, echoing through the empty space below. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just some strange noise from the machinery or an animal somewhere, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and made my way to the central stairwell. The building was mostly dark, the only light coming from the weak overhead lamps flickering above me. The thud sounded again, closer now, like something, or someone, was pounding against the concrete, trying to break through. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. My heart was beating faster, the quiet of the night broken only by the rhythmic thuds that echoed from below. The noise seemed to come from deeper in the foundation, somewhere below the construction site's lower levels. I'd worked here for months, but I'd never seen anything beyond the first few floors. The rest of the building had been sealed off for safety. But tonight something felt different. I headed toward the elevator shaft. It was locked, like the rest of the site, but it always had a set of keys to the restricted areas. I moved through the halls, the sound of my footsteps echoing back at me, blending with the distant thudding that was growing louder by the minute. Each step I took felt heavier, like the weight of the building itself was pressing down on me. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the rusted door that led to the basement, the door creaking as I pushed it open. A gust of cold air hit me, carrying with it a strange, metallic smell, something that didn't belong in a building like this. I stepped into the dark corridor below, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. The thud came again, this time followed by a scraping sound. It was coming from deeper inside. I moved cautiously, each step hesitant, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The farther I went, the colder it became. The air felt damp, and the floor was slick beneath my boots. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, I saw it. At the end of the hall, there was a crack in the wall. It wasn't big, just a small, jagged tear in the concrete, but through it, I could see something moving in the dark. I froze, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. There was no line down here. No reason for anything to be moving. Yet, someone was. The thudding stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. I couldn't breathe. Then, from the crack, I saw it, a hand. It wasn't like any hand I had ever seen. Pale and thin, with long, crooked fingers that seemed to stretch out from the darkness, reaching toward the gap in the wall. I stumbled back, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. It was impossible. No one had been down here for years. No one could have gotten in. The building was sealed off, abandoned. And yet, there was something, or someone, trapped beneath the concrete. The hand gripped the edge of the crack, its fingers curling and pulling as if trying to break free. I could hear a low growl, something deep and guttural, coming from the depths of the wall. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet were frozen to the spot. Another thud. Then another. Louder this time, as if whatever was in the wall was getting closer, moving toward me. The scraping sound grew more frantic, more desperate. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding against my chest. The sound followed me, getting closer with each step. The walls felt like they were closing in, the floor groaning beneath me. I reached the stairs, but as I looked up, I saw the door at the top was no longer there. The building had changed. The walls had moved. And the sound was coming from all sides now, thudding and scraping, closer than ever. And I knew, whatever was down there, whatever had been sealed away, it was coming for me. I had to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, I could feel the darkness closing in, swallowing me whole. The sound was everywhere, and I was no longer sure where it was coming from. I don't know how long I ran. My legs felt like jelly, my heart hammering in my chest, but every time I thought I was near the exit, the sound would pull me back. The scraping, the thudding, it was relentless, and it was growing louder. The air around me was thick, heavy with the smell of something decaying, something wrong. The walls felt as though they were pressing in, closing the space around me, and with every step, the noise grew more intense. I reached the main hallway again, gasping for breath, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The corridor that had once felt like a familiar, safe place now felt alien. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the floor beneath my boots groaned as if the building itself were alive, shifting, waiting. I turned down another hallway, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The construction site, the strange sounds, the hand that had emerged from the crack in the wall, it didn't make sense. This wasn't supposed to be a haunted building. This wasn't supposed to be anything other than concrete and steel. And yet, the thudding echoed through the walls again, followed by a low hiss, like something wet dragging across the ground. I froze. The sound was closer now, impossibly close. I turned, scanning the hallway with the flickering beam of my flashlight. But there was nothing but darkness. I strained my ears, hoping to hear some sign of what was happening, but the silence that followed the sound was almost worse than the noise itself. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things anymore. The walls felt as though they were breathing. The temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath in the air. Then, the scraping began again. It was no longer coming from the crack in the wall. Now, it was coming from above me. The sound was dragging across the ceiling, closer and closer. I looked up, my flashlight beam scanning the high, unfinished ceiling. For a moment, everything was still. But then, from the shadows above, something moved. A figure. Long and thin, slithering across the beams, its body scraping against the concrete as it moved. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp, but I couldn't look away. The thing above me was too dark, too blurred to make out completely, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel it waiting, as if it knew exactly where I was, as if it knew what I was about to do. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The scraping stopped. The thing, whatever it was, had moved away, vanished into the shadows of the unfinished building. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, but something deep inside me told me I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get out before whatever that thing was found me. I turned and ran again, my feet stumbling over debris, the walls and the floor shifting beneath me. The building seemed to have a life of its own, twisting and turning, reshaping itself to trap me. I had no idea which way was up or down anymore. And then, just when I thought I might be able to find an exit, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint at first, a soft whisper coming from somewhere below, so quiet I wasn't sure if I was hearing it at all. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many. They were coming from the ground, from beneath the concrete. The whispers were low, urgent, like a chorus of lost souls, calling me, beckoning me to come closer. Help, help us, come closer. I tried to block out the voices, shaking my head, but they wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't think straight. I had to keep moving. I had to get out. But the voices, they were pulling at me. They were reaching out, wrapping around my mind, telling me that I couldn't leave, that I was meant to be here. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to go toward them. But then, I heard something that made me freeze in place. A voice. A familiar voice. Don't listen to them. It was a man's voice. Weak, trembling, but unmistakable. I knew that voice. It was the voice of the previous guard. The one who had worked the night shift before me. He had vanished a week before, no one knew where he went. They assumed he quit or something, but I had a feeling now that he hadn't just left. He was still here. He was still trapped here. Where are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible, my breath catching in my throat. I'm here, underneath. I didn't need to hear more. My heart skipped a beat as the realization hit me. The guard, he hadn't disappeared. He had been trapped down here, somewhere beneath the concrete, somewhere deep within the building's dark, unfinished belly. I had to find him. I had to get him out. But as I turned to retrace my steps, the ground beneath me shifted again. The floor trembled, groaning as if something massive, something heavy, was moving below, pressing up against the concrete. The whispers intensified, becoming frantic. The thuds came faster, harder. It was like the walls were closing in on me, and whatever was beneath the ground was about to break free. I knew I had to make a choice. I could try to find the guard, try to uncover what had happened to him, or I could run. Run as fast as I could and hope whatever was down there didn't catch me. The ground shuddered again, and the whispers turned into screams. "Help us." And then I heard it. The sound of something massive, something alive, breaking through the concrete, rising toward me. There was no more time. I turned and ran, blindly, toward the exit. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just running from whatever was below. I was running from something much worse. I was running from the truth. The sound of the thing moving beneath the concrete was now deafening. It was no longer subtle, no longer distant. It was right beneath me, closer with every second, and it was coming up fast. The walls seemed to tremble with its movement, vibrating under the force of its desperation to break free. I could feel the vibrations in my bones, a constant hum that rattled my teeth. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs were on autopilot now, running as fast as I could through the maze of hallways and stairwells, the flashlight trembling in my grip. I stumbled, nearly tripping over a piece of metal sticking out from the floor, but I caught myself and kept running. The building was no longer the quiet, abandoned structure I had once thought it to be. It had become something alive, something that was aware of me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispers and thudding followed me, like a shadow, always just behind, just out of reach. Each time I thought I had outrun them, they grew louder, more urgent. The growl from below intensified, like the thing in the foundation was clawing its way up, inch by inch, through the earth, through the concrete, determined to reach me. I rounded a corner, heart pounding, gasping for air. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my body screaming for a break, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever was down here. That's when I heard it. A loud crack echoed through the building, followed by the sickening sound of something tearing through steel. The floor shook violently, sending me crashing to my knees. The flashlight slid from my hand, rolling across the floor and landing in the darkness. I couldn't see anything now, the entire building plunged into pitch black. But I didn't need to see. The sound of something moving in the dark was enough. A low, slithering hiss, followed by something scraping against the walls. My breath caught in my throat as the thudding grew louder, closer. It was all around me, echoing off the concrete, the very building itself seeming to pulse with the sound. I pushed myself to my feet, blind in the darkness, my heart racing faster with every passing moment. The air was thick with the smell of dust, metal, and something else, something metallic, almost sour. And then I heard it. A voice. This time, it wasn't the faint whisper of the other trapped souls. It was the guard. "You're not alone. Don't leave me." His voice was desperate, strained, barely a whisper, but it still cut through the overwhelming noise like a knife. I froze, my body tensing as I tried to pinpoint the sound. The voice wasn't coming from the direction I'd just run from. No, it was coming from beneath me, from deeper in the building. "Help me, help us, we're down here." I shook my head, trying to push the voice out of my mind. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to get out. I had to survive. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the voice seemed to call to me, pleading, begging for help. The thudding grew louder, closer. The scraping was now accompanied by a deep, guttural growl, something alive, something dangerous. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to find a way out. But the voices, the whispers, the screams had a hold on me. They were tugging at my mind, forcing me to listen, to turn back. And deep down, I knew that if I didn't find out what had happened here, if I didn't find the truth, I wouldn't escape. I turned toward the source of the voice, my hand gripping the cold metal of the nearby door handle. The building seemed to sway, groaning under the strain of whatever was happening inside it. The walls were closing in, the ceiling pressing down, as though the entire place was about to collapse. I opened the door, my flashlight flickering back to life, casting a weak beam across the room. It was small, barely more than a storage closet, but there was something in it, someone. A figure, hunched over, crouched in the corner. At first, I thought it was the guard, but as my flashlight illuminated its face, I froze. It wasn't him. The thing in the corner was wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were wide and vacant, staring at me with an unnatural, predatory gaze. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its hunger, pressing in on me. Behind it, the wall was cracked, smashed open, revealing a deep, dark void that seemed to stretch on forever. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out the sound of the thing shifting in the shadows. It was no longer still. It was crawling toward me, its thin, brittle limbs scraping against the floor. That's when I realized. The thing in the room wasn't trying to escape from the building. It was waiting for something. Waiting for me. No, please. The voice, once again, came from deep beneath the floor. It was the guard. But this time, his voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream. A scream of pure terror, a scream that echoed through the entire building, bouncing off the walls, filling every crevice. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to. The building groaned and cracked around me, as if the very foundation was crumbling, giving way to whatever was below. The thing was following me. I could hear its scrabbling footsteps, its low growl, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. I reached the main exit. The door that had once been locked was now wide open. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through it, slamming it behind me, gasping for air as I stumbled into the night. I was outside. I was free. But as I looked back at the building, the shadows seemed to shift. I could still hear the echoes of the thudding, the growling, and the whispers. Always the whispers. I thought I was safe. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was inside that building, whatever had been trapped beneath the concrete for all these years, was still out there. And it was waiting for me to return. The night air felt colder than it should have. I stood there in front of the building, my breath shallow and quick, my heart still racing. The silence around me felt too loud, too unnatural. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything, but there were no answers, only questions. How could I have missed it? How had I not known there was something beneath the building? Something alive? I glanced back at the construction site, the looming structure still towering over me, casting long, crooked shadows in the pale moonlight. I had thought I was free, that stepping out into the night would be the end of it. But I felt it in my gut, the cold knot that twisted deep inside me. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be. The whispers hadn't stopped. Even now, as I stood there, I could hear them, faint, almost drowned out by the wind. But they were still there, calling me, telling me I couldn't leave, telling me that I had to go back. I shook my head, trying to block out the noise. I had escaped. I was out. I didn't need to go back. But something about the voice, the guard's voice, still lingered in my mind. The way he had pleaded for help. The way he had been trapped. How long had he been down there? How long had whatever that thing was been waiting for someone to find it? To set it free? I couldn't just leave. Not like this. I turned toward the building, my feet moving against my will. The door was still open. The air felt thick with the weight of the place, like the structure itself was pulling me in. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body refused. I had already made the choice. I had to know what was really going on. I had to face whatever I had left behind. The door creaked closed behind me as I stepped inside. The darkness was thicker now, more suffocating. The place smelled like mildew and decay, but there was something else. Something metallic. Blood. I reached for the flashlight in my jacket pocket, feeling the cold, smooth metal. I switched it on, the beam of light cutting through the thick darkness. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, silent. But I could feel it. The building wasn't empty. It was alive, waiting, watching. I moved cautiously, stepping through the eerily quiet corridors. The farther I went, the heavier the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched, of being followed. But there was no sound. No movement. Just the feeling that something was waiting for me, just out of sight. Then, I heard it again. The scraping. Soft at first, like fingernails on stone, then louder, harder. It was coming from deep beneath me. I could feel it vibrating in the floor beneath my feet. My heart thudded in my chest, and I instinctively backed up against the wall, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The scraping was coming closer, and the growling, low, guttural, like something hungry, was growing louder, more furious. The thing below was coming. Help me. It was the guard again. His voice echoed through the building, but it wasn't like before. This time, it wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. I stumbled down the hallway, following the sound of his voice, my heart pounding in my ears. The walls seemed to warp, the shadows stretching unnaturally, crawling along the floors like they were alive. The building was shifting. It wasn't just decaying, it was changing. I turned another corner, and there it was. The crack. The same crack in the wall where I had seen the first hint of the thing trying to break free. It was wider now, jagged edges of broken concrete hanging loose, as though something had tried to claw its way out. But there was something new. A faint, eerie light coming from inside the crack, pulsing like a heartbeat. Without thinking, I moved toward it. The moment I touched the wall, the ground beneath me shook violently. A deep, rumbling growl split the air, sending a shockwave of fear through my entire body. The floor cracked open, and something massive, began to push its way up, forcing the concrete and steel to bend and crack as if it were nothing more than paper. The building groaned. And then, from deep beneath the floor, a massive hand, clawed, dark, covered in thick, writhing veins, shot up through the opening, grasping at the air as if trying to pull itself free. I screamed, stumbling backward, but my legs refused to move. My feet were frozen, rooted to the spot, as the hand reached higher, tearing through the concrete, its claws scraping the floor, its weight shaking the building even more violently. It wasn't alone. As the hand pulled the thing free, the ceiling above me began to crack, and from the shadows, dark figures began to emerge. They were crawling, dragging themselves from the cracks in the walls and floor, their bodies thin and twisted, covered in the same dark veins. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, screams, shouts, cries of agony as the creatures, the things, moved toward me. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was the guard's. But it was distorted, changed, like something had twisted it. He wasn't the same. He was one of them now. I realized, with a sickening jolt of horror, what had happened. The guard hadn't disappeared. He hadn't been trapped. He had become part of whatever was down there. And now, it was my turn. I turned to run, but the walls closed in on me, the air thick and suffocating, and the creatures were everywhere, crawling, dragging themselves toward me. There was no escape. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time doesn't mean much when you're locked in darkness, when every second stretches into infinity. My head ached as I slowly regained awareness, a dull, pulsing throb in the back of my skull. The air around me was thick, heavy, suffocating. I tried to open my eyes, but the darkness was so complete it felt like it was pressing against my eyelids, keeping me from seeing anything. My body ached. Every muscle felt like it had been stretched to its limit, and my chest burned with each shallow breath I took. Something was wrong. The faint, oppressive feeling of the building's weight, the same pressure I'd felt before I blacked out, was still there. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit up, my hands scraping against cold concrete. The echo of my movement was unnaturally loud, ringing in the silence like a drumbeat. I tried to push myself to my feet, but something was wrong. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me. I felt disoriented, as though I had been submerged in water for hours, struggling to resurface. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My throat felt dry, raw. Panic began to rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. I needed to focus. I needed to figure out where I was, what was happening. Slowly, I reached out into the blackness, my fingers brushing against something wet, sticky. I recoiled instinctively, my heart racing, but I couldn't tell what it was. I tried again, this time more carefully, and felt the cold metal of a pipe against my hand. My fingers traced its surface, following it until I came to a small gap between it and the wall. A space. A crack. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows just beyond my reach. I could hear them, their slow, labored breathing, ragged and uneven. I strained my ears, but all I could hear were the faintest of whispers. "No, please. Please, help me." The voice. The guard. But it wasn't his voice anymore. It was warped, strained, as though it had been altered, stretched by something that was far beyond human. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me. My muscles locked in place, but my body refused to turn. I could feel its presence. It was there. Something, or someone, had moved closer. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of mold, of death. The very ground beneath me felt like it was moving, shifting, breathing. Then, I felt it. Cold, bony fingers brushed against my skin, as light as a feather, but the touch was enough to send a jolt of electricity through my body. I shot upright, my pulse spiking, and I finally managed to scream. But it was a desperate, choked sound, half-formed. I didn't care. I needed to get out. I had to. A low growl interrupted my thoughts, and I froze, every muscle in my body locking with terror. The sound vibrated through the walls, through my very bones. I knew then that it wasn't just the guard. Whatever was down here, whatever I had awakened, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should have existed. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the soft scraping sound that had followed me through the halls. But this time, the scraping wasn't distant. It was right there, just beyond my reach. A shadow, darker than the rest, was creeping toward me from the corner of the room. It was taking shape, stretching, growing. Something monstrous. I wanted to scream again, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I could only watch as the thing inched closer, its form becoming clearer, a hulking shape, twisted and jagged, covered in dark, matted fur and broken limbs, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. The room felt colder, like the very air was being drained of life. And then, in a moment of sheer horror, I realized it wasn't alone. From every crack, from every shadow, more figures began to emerge, more creatures. Their bodies were thin, brittle, stretched out like marionettes with too many joints, too many fingers. They shuffled toward me in a disjointed, painful motion, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I had to move. I had to. I scrambled backward, my hands hitting the concrete floor, but the creatures were faster. I felt one of them grab my ankle, pulling me back with terrifying strength. My heart slammed against my chest, my mind screaming, "No! No! No!" I twisted, kicking out, desperately trying to free myself. My hand found something sharp, a broken piece of metal, and I swung it blindly, catching one of the creatures across the face. It howled, a sound that was both human and animal, but it didn't stop. It only pulled harder, dragging me toward the others. Then, from the darkness, I heard something else, a voice. A voice I recognized. "Leave him alone." It was the guard. The rail guard. His voice, broken, distorted, but still familiar. The creatures paused, their heads turning toward the voice, as though they understood. They let go of me, allowing me to scramble away. The guard's voice was weak, barely a whisper now, but I could hear the authority in it. He was still alive. Somehow. "You have to go, you have to leave now." His words echoed in my mind, and the building around me seemed to shift again, groaning in protest. The walls trembled, as though the very foundations of the place were trying to reject what was happening. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The creatures did not follow. They stood still, watching me as I fled, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I could hear the sound of their claws scraping against the concrete behind me, but I couldn't stop. I reached the exit, finally, and slammed the door behind me, falling to my knees in the cold night air. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath, ragged and broken. I wasn't sure if I was alive or if I had just escaped something far worse. But I knew one thing with certainty. The building was still alive. And it was waiting. And one day, it would come for me again. I've always wondered what it would feel like to be watched. You don't really think about it much, at least, not until it happens. Have you ever noticed someone in your daily routine, sitting still, blending into the background? And then, for reasons you can't explain, you start to see them. Every time you look, they're there. I started seeing her about a week ago. At first, it was nothing more than a passing glance. A woman, somewhere in her 40s, always sitting alone on the same bench in the park near my apartment. Her eyes were vacant, blank. Not angry or sad or happy, just empty. I'd walk by, and it was like she wasn't even really there. But she was. Every day. I thought nothing of it at first. People sit in parks all the time. But something about her stuck with me, like a song you can't get out of your head. Every time I passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes followed me. I tried to ignore it. It's probably just my imagination. Maybe she had a reason for sitting there. Maybe she was just waiting for something. But the feeling lingered. The second time I noticed it, I found myself staring at her longer. Too long. Her face, frozen, pale, like an unpainted mask, remained unchanged. I could almost feel her looking at me, even when her gaze didn't waver. I didn't want to be the type of person who stared, but my legs moved slower and slower, as though they were tied to her presence. And then it happened. I walked past her again, and this time, when I glanced at her, she was looking directly at me. Not just her eyes. Her whole face. I froze. I couldn't look away. Her expression remained the same, empty, hollow, but her gaze, it felt like it was piercing right through me, as if she could see everything I've ever done, every thought I've ever had. I quickly turned away, my heart starting to race. Was I imagining things? Was this just some random person doing nothing but sitting on a bench? But I couldn't shake the discomfort. The next day, I saw her again. And the day after that. Same spot, same bench. The same unblinking stare. I tried to avoid looking directly at her, but each time I passed by, I felt her eyes on me. It was like I couldn't escape her, like she was somehow in my head, pulling me back, drawing me in. It was on the fourth day that things started to get strange. I was walking through the park again, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. I hadn't planned to look her way, but as I neared the bench, I saw her out of the corner of my eye, just as I had every day. She was there, of course, sitting still, her pale face turned slightly toward me. But this time, she wasn't sitting as she usually did. She had shifted. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, just enough that I could see her eyes, wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead. Not at me, at nothing. Just a few feet beyond where I stood. I didn't stop walking this time. I couldn't bring myself to glance over, to risk making eye contact again. I quickened my pace, but as I did, I heard something. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. It was a voice, soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but unmistakable. It said something. Come closer. I froze in place. The whisper didn't sound like it came from her. It felt like it came from somewhere else, somewhere inside my head. Come closer. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The words clung to me, wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with each breath I took. My legs carried me away from the park, but my mind stayed behind, caught in the pull of that whisper. I didn't go back to the park the next day. I couldn't. The thought of that woman, of her empty, unblinking stare, haunted me. But I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. A few days passed, and the paranoia started to fade. I told myself I was being ridiculous. People sit in parks. They stare. It's nothing. But then, something happened that made me rethink everything. I went out for a walk, trying to clear my head. I turned a corner, and the park came into view. It was late in the evening, the air cool and crisp. I almost didn't want to go near, but I found myself walking toward it. I didn't think she'd be there. It was late, after all. But she was. There she sat on that same bench. The same position. Her face was just as empty, her gaze locked forward. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was someone else sitting beside her. Someone I hadn't noticed before, someone that blended into the shadows. I could barely make out the figure, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing with no distinguishing features. The figure sat motionless, its back to me. My heart began to race. I stood frozen at the edge of the park, watching. The woman's head slowly turned toward me, her eyes locking with mine, but this time there was no discomfort, no chill. There was only recognition. A cold, empty recognition. The figure beside her, no longer just a shadow, shifted. It stood. The movement was smooth, unnervingly slow, and as it did, the air around me seemed to distort, like a faint ripple in a still pond. I could feel it, its presence, closing in. The woman stood too. They were walking toward me, their movements synchronized, like they were one entity, a single form. The figure beside her wasn't just a person. It was something else, something wrong. The way it moved, the way it was no longer quite human, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in a voice that wasn't hers, but still from her, I heard it again. Come closer. I ran. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out, until the world around me blurred with panic. But I didn't dare look back. The cold, empty gaze was still there, following, always watching. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, vacant and lifeless, staring through me, just as it had been in the park. It was the same sense of suffocating dread that clung to me in the hours after I ran, the image of that figure walking toward me, unnaturally slow, forever burned into my mind. I knew I had to go back. I couldn't leave it like this, couldn't let the fear fester. But I wasn't ready, not yet. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly, the streets bustling with people who seemed completely unaware of the unsettling presence that had taken hold of me. I couldn't concentrate on anything, work, errands, even just passing through the familiar streets, everything felt off. Like there was something lurking just out of sight, something I couldn't escape. I told myself it was just paranoia, just nerves. People see things, hear things when they're scared. I needed to get a grip. So, after another restless day, I found myself standing in front of the park again. The wind felt colder than usual, biting through the sleeves of my jacket. My feet were rooted to the ground as I stared at the entrance, debating whether to walk in or turn away. The park was the last place I wanted to be, yet somehow, it felt like the only place I could be. I stepped inside. The trees, now bare from the autumn chill, rustled faintly in the breeze. The familiar path wound ahead, lined with benches that seemed harmless enough in the daylight. It was quieter than usual, only a few joggers and dog walkers passing by. I forced myself to take slow, steady steps, my heart thudding louder with every footfall. Every bench I passed felt like a potential trap, like something was waiting behind each one. But I kept walking, past the familiar places where I'd always felt safe. And then, I saw her. The woman was sitting on the same bench again, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Her face, empty as ever, was turned toward the path. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She hadn't moved since the last time I saw her, had she? It felt impossible that she could sit there, day after day, unchanged. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my distance. But she was so close now. It was almost as if she knew I'd come back. Without thinking, I began to walk toward her. My steps grew heavier as I approached, each one sinking deeper into the ground, like the earth itself was trying to pull me under. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, oppressive. When I was just a few feet away from the bench, I stopped. Her eyes hadn't moved, but I could feel them on me, locking onto me with a pressure that felt suffocating. I didn't dare look at her directly. But then, she moved. It was subtle at first. Her fingers twitched. A slight shift in her posture. My heart raced as she slowly turned her head. And just like before, her eyes met mine. But this time, there was something different. There was a faint flicker in them, as if something had changed inside, like they were more aware, more alive than they had been before. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I couldn't move. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between us. The world around me seemed to blur, the sounds of the park growing distant. The whisper from the night before echoed in my ears. "Come closer." It wasn't her voice. It couldn't be. It was deeper, colder, as if it came from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere far beyond her empty expression. The air grew colder still. I shivered despite myself, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. It was like my feet were glued to the ground. The park around me had disappeared, replaced by a quiet, suffocating darkness that crept into the edges of my vision. I had to leave. I had to get away. I took a step back, then another, but the moment I moved, she spoke again, louder this time. "Come closer." It wasn't a request. It was a command. My legs felt heavy, like they were filled with cement. I couldn't escape. Her gaze was so intense, so consuming, that I felt as though I was sinking into it, like I was being pulled into the emptiness of her eyes. My breath quickened. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The park, the streets, everything blurred around me as I ran through the city, until I was far enough from her presence to feel my heart slowing down. But even then, even as the panic began to subside, a new fear settled in. I had left the park, but I hadn't escaped the feeling. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. What was she? Who was she? And why did I feel like she was always there, even when I wasn't looking? It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had shifted inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she was already following me. That she had always been following me. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't tell if I was more afraid of what I'd seen or the way it all felt, like something had breached the surface of reality, something that didn't belong. My thoughts became a twisted spiral. I'd catch myself staring at strangers in the street, wondering if they were looking at me the way she had. It was exhausting, the constant watching, the endless feeling of being watched. I didn't go back to the park. But it didn't matter. Her presence haunted me, lingering in the corners of every room, every shadow. Even in my apartment, I found it hard to relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window, set my nerves on edge. It was as if the world itself had changed, turned against me in some subtle way. But the worst part? The worst part was the dreams. They started the night I ran from her, a twisting mix of reality and nightmare. At first, they were vague, flashes of the park, her eyes, the cold air. But soon, they became more vivid, more real. I was walking through the park again, the trees looming over me, their branches stretching like twisted fingers. The same bench sat there, waiting. But this time, she wasn't sitting on it. She was standing, her face turned away, as though waiting for me. I knew I had to turn back, that I was walking into something I couldn't escape. But my legs wouldn't obey. I was pulled toward her, forced to move forward, step after slow step. The closer I got, the more the air grew thick, suffocating, until I was standing in front of her, just inches away. She turned then, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes met mine. But this time, they weren't empty. There was something inside them. Something dark. I tried to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my breath stuck in my throat. She reached out, her cold hand brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of ice through me. And then I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just a dream, just a product of my own fear, but the line between dream and reality blurred. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching me, waiting. I spent most of the next day trying to avoid the park. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I had seen her, and now she was in my thoughts, my dreams, my reality. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I found myself standing at the edge of the park once more, heart pounding in my chest, the late afternoon sun casting long, stretching shadows across the ground. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I forced myself to take the first step, then another. And another. The trees whispered in the wind, their bare branches scratching against one another like the claws of some unseen predator. The park felt different now, darker, as if it had become a place where time itself didn't exist. I made my way through, eyes darting to every corner, every bench. But she wasn't there. A moment of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I kept walking. The path twisted in ways I didn't remember. It was like the park had shifted, become something else entirely. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the quiet. The few people still around seemed distant, like figures in a fog, unaware of the growing unease pressing in around me. And then, I saw her. She wasn't sitting on the bench this time. She was standing in the distance, facing the trees, her back to me. But something was different. She wasn't alone. There was another figure, a tall, dark shape standing beside her. Its features were indistinct, like shadows that couldn't quite hold shape, but I could feel it, like it was watching me. And the moment I saw them, the woman turned. But she didn't look like she had before. Her expression was twisted now, a slow smile spreading across her face, an unnatural, inhuman thing. Her eyes, those empty eyes, were no longer blank. They were alive, gleaming with something darker. Something that wasn't human. A voice broke the silence, sharp and cold, like nails on glass. You shouldn't have come back. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was something deeper, coming from the figure beside her. It spoke through her, or perhaps it was her now, a hollow shell with something else inside, controlling her every move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't run. Everything around me seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, colder. The park had become a prison. The trees crowded in like walls, trapping me. I could hear them now, the whispers, like 1,000 voices overlapping, rising and falling in a maddening rhythm. "You're already part of it," the voice said. "There's no going back now." I staggered back, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. I was falling, sinking into the earth itself. I wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare, helplessly, as the figures in front of me slowly closed the distance. "Come closer." The command echoed in my mind, stronger now, more insistent. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. And somehow, I knew I had no choice. I could move, not at first. It was like something had frozen me in place, a coldness seeping into my very bones. The park, the air, the ground beneath me, everything felt distant, like I was no longer part of the world. I could barely hear the rustling of the trees, the faint hum of distant traffic. All that existed in that moment was the figure in front of me, that unnatural, twisted version of the woman I had seen so many times before. Her smile, it wasn't a smile at all. It was a grotesque thing, stretching too wide, too far, like the mouth of something far older, far darker than anything I could understand. Her eyes glowed with something that wasn't light. They were pools of darkness, yet they pulled me in, dragged me deeper with every passing second. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice echoed again, this time so close I could feel the words vibrating in my skull. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, pushing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. "I need to leave. I need to get out of here." The thought flashed through my mind, but my body refused to obey. Step by step, the woman moved closer, but it wasn't her walking. It was as if she was being guided by something else, something that wasn't hers to control. I snapped out of my stupor long enough to realize that I had to run. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribcage, and for a split second, I thought I could escape. But then, the trees around me seemed to twist. The path I had taken only moments before now led nowhere. There were no exits, no clear way out. It was as if the park had become a maze, its walls closing in. "You'll never escape," the voice purred. "We've been waiting for you." Waiting? My mind reeled. What did that even mean? I felt the air around me thicken, as though the very atmosphere had become a suffocating force. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking, but I could hardly hear my footsteps over the thundering in my head. The woman, no, whatever she had become, was getting closer. I couldn't let her reach me. Desperation fueled my movements. I dashed to the right, toward the edge of the park where the trees were sparse. But every step felt like I was wading through thick, invisible sludge. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic. I could feel them in my mind, clawing at the edges of my sanity, digging deep into my thoughts. And then, there it was, a sharp, chilling laugh echoing around me. It wasn't just one laugh, it was a chorus, 1,000 voices all laughing at once, mocking me, as if they knew I couldn't escape. "You can't run from what's already inside." The voice shattered my resolve. The words wrapped themselves around my mind, sinking deep into my subconscious like a poison. I stopped, panting, my hands pressed against my head as if trying to block out the sound, the invasion. The trees, they weren't trees anymore. The bark had become grotesque, twisted faces, eyes following me as I moved. The shadows between them were alive, shifting, reaching out for me. I forced myself to look away. Focus on the path. Keep moving. But when I turned my gaze ahead, I found myself staring into the woman's face again, mere feet away. The smile was still there, But now there was something more, a flicker of recognition in those hollow eyes. It was as if she knew me. Had I always known her? The thought hit me like a brick. You see it now, don't you? Her voice was softer now, almost sympathetic. You were never meant to leave. I backed away, my head spinning. This wasn't just some woman, it was something else. Something that had taken her form. Something that had been watching me, waiting for me, all along. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she meant. I wasn't just lost in a park. I was lost in my own mind. It wasn't just the park that had changed, it was me. I had become part of whatever this was, pulled into its web, trapped in a place where reality and nightmare bled together. I can't breathe. I can't think. The trees seemed to close in, the shadows dancing in time with the beating of my heart. I could hear my pulse in my ears, each throb louder than the last. It felt like the park was alive, a breathing, living thing, and I was its prey. You belong to us now, the voice echoed, 1,000 whispers swirling around me. You always have. And then, something shifted. The ground beneath my feet buckled, and I fell hard onto my knees. The world around me began to warp, the trees, the faces, the park itself, bending and twisting as though reality itself was crumbling. But there, in the chaos, I saw her again. No, She stood in front of me, but now, she wasn't just an empty shell. Her face had filled with something alive. A look of hunger. The smile faded into something darker. Her hand reached out to me, and I felt the cold fingers graze my skin, sending a chill through my entire body. There's nowhere to hide now, it whispered. Come with us. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than fear. I was losing myself. I was already part of this thing, this nightmare. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, I realized something worse than the darkness closing in on me. I was never meant to escape. Not now. Not ever. The world tilted, everything around me spiraling into a nauseating blur. My vision blurred, my mind scrambled to grasp something, anything, that felt real. But all I saw were eyes. Thousands of them. Floating, watching, waiting. They blinked in unison, and I could hear the faintest rustle, like whispers from 1,000 mouths all speaking at once. It was too much. The sound, the sensation, it overwhelmed me. I tried to stand, to break free from the strange pull that gripped me, but my legs felt like they were sinking into the earth. The ground wasn't solid anymore, it was soft, like wet clay, pulling me in, sucking me deeper with every desperate movement I made. The woman, it towered over me now, its face contorted, shifting, like it was made of liquid, something unnatural. The features rippled, the hollow eyes glowed, and that smile, that awful, wide smile was stretched across its face, never ending. It's too late, it said, its voice now layered with 1,000 different tones, all harmonizing, all wrong. You belong to the park now. You're a part of us. You always were. I fought against the feeling that was smothering me, the reality that was slipping through my fingers. No, I'm not one of them. I can't be. I won't be. But the more I resisted, the harder it became to differentiate between what was real and what was, whatever this was. Everything around me seemed to fold in on itself. The trees were no longer trees. They were limbs, twisting, reaching, crawling out from the soil, dragging themselves toward me. The faces in the bark, they weren't just watching now. They were calling me. I heard their voices in my head, each one begging me to come closer, to give in. I screamed, my voice lost in the cacophony of the park's strange, monstrous whispers. I tried to run, but my body didn't obey. My legs buckled beneath me. My arms flailed, but the air felt thick, like I was pushing against water. Each movement was sluggish, heavy, and each second stretched into an eternity. "Don't fight it," it said, crouching down in front of me. Its smile grew wider, impossibly wide. "You're already ours. You've always been." The fear, the helplessness, I felt it in every fiber of my being. But there was something else, something darker. Something was changing inside me. I realized then I was no longer myself. The man who had walked into this park was gone. Something else had taken his place. I could feel the shift, the change, as if my very soul was being absorbed into the twisted, shifting shadows of the park. The air around me grew colder, but not just cold. It was freezing, freezing to the point of burning. My skin prickled with the sensation of something crawling under it, like insects moving just beneath the surface. I wanted to claw at it, to tear it off, but my hands wouldn't obey. My fingers were stiff, cold. "Look at yourself," the voice urged, gentle now, almost kind. "You're one of us now." I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My mouth opened, but no sound escaped. My eyes were wide open, staring down at my hands. They were changing. No, they weren't changing, they were becoming. The skin was pulling away, the flesh shifting, bending, growing cold and wrong. The bones beneath were no longer mine, no longer human. They were growing, twisting, elongating. I looked up, and the woman was still there, but now she wasn't alone. The faces, the eyes from the trees, they were all around me, pulling closer, merging into one, all feeding into the same dark mass, a collective. The park had become a part of me, and I had become a part of it. There was no escape. "You'll never leave," it whispered again, its voice now a part of the wind, the trees, the very ground beneath me. "There's nothing left for you but us." I tried to scream again, but nothing came. I had been swallowed whole. The faces smiled, and I was lost forever. Have you ever found something you weren't supposed to find? A thing so unexpected that it makes you question the very fabric of your reality? Well, I found something like that today. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it started as one. I had just gotten up, still groggy, and walked over to my mailbox, like I did every day. The sun was just starting to peek through the blinds, and the world outside seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Nothing unusual about it. But there, wedged between the usual bills and advertisements, was an envelope. A plain, white envelope addressed to me. I froze when I saw it. It wasn't the kind of letter you expect. No return address, just my name written in a neat, yet unfamiliar hand. The handwriting was too perfect, almost like it was printed, but with just enough slant to give it a personal touch. I don't know why, but I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I held it. My fingers traced the edges, hesitating for a moment before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I pulled it out and read the first line, and that's when my heart skipped a beat. "I know everything about you." The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch in the gut. My mind raced. Who would write this? Who would know anything about me? The address, the handwriting, all of it was wrong. There was nothing familiar about it. But then I looked closer at the paper, at the rest of the letter. I know you've been feeling watched lately. The way you glance over your shoulder when no one's there. The way you hear footsteps following you, even when the streets are empty. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just letting you know I'm watching, just like you've been watching. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone about those feelings. I hadn't told anyone how, every night, I could feel someone's eyes on me as I lay in bed. The quiet tapping sound that always seemed to come from the walls, or the sudden cold drafts that would sweep through my room for no reason. No one knew. No one except this person. I tried to steady my breathing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know who could be sending this, but it felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. My hands were shaking as I continued to read. You probably have questions. Like, how do I know these things? The truth is, I've been there, watching you for a long time. Don't worry. This isn't a game, and this isn't a mistake. You'll understand soon. The letter ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the paper in my hands, my mind spinning. The world outside had shifted, become something darker, more uncertain. I had never been a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts or strange forces. But this felt different. Had someone been following me all this time? Was this just a sick joke? Or was there something far worse at play? The letter had mentioned soon, and somehow that word haunted me. Because deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. I don't know why I kept the letter. Maybe part of me was hoping it would explain itself. Maybe I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start of something far more terrifying. And as the day wore on, I started to notice things. Little things. A shadow just outside my window, a faint tap against the wall I hadn't noticed before. A voice, low and distant, echoing just beyond my hearing. I wasn't alone anymore. And I wasn't sure who was watching me, or why. But I knew one thing for sure, the letter wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. The days after the letter arrived were strange. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than before. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to move. I tried to tell myself that it was just paranoia. After all, who wouldn't be shaken by something like that? A letter written by someone who knew things no one else could know. It had to be a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I went to work the next day, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a cold fog that I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks at hand, sorting emails, answering calls, doing anything to distract myself from the creeping dread that had settled in my chest. But it didn't work. Every time I looked up from my desk, I thought I saw someone watching me from across the room. Someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. But when I turned, the space was always empty. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was as if someone was just behind me, their footsteps mirroring mine, keeping pace with every step I took. I rushed home, my heart hammering in my chest, and locked the door behind me. I turned on all the lights. I checked every window, every closet, every corner of the apartment. It was empty. No one was there. But still, the feeling lingered, like something was waiting for me just beyond the threshold. I tried to go to sleep, but my eyes wouldn't stay shut. The tapping sounds had returned. Soft at first, like something gently tapping against the wall. I told myself it was just the pipes or the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. And then it stopped. I held my breath. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Soft and familiar. I'm right here. I shot up in bed, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was still. Quiet. Empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I looked around, but there was nothing except the cold air and the creeping feeling that something was watching me. I must have fallen asleep after that, though I don't remember drifting off. The next morning, I woke to find something new. Another letter. It was waiting for me on the kitchen counter. This time, it wasn't addressed to me in the same neat handwriting. The words were different, messier, as if someone had written them in a hurry, in a fit of urgency. The ink had smudged in places, and the paper was slightly torn at the edges, as though it had been handled too many times. You felt it last night, didn't you? The presence? The whisper? It's getting closer. You can't run from this. My fingers trembled as I read the words. I thought I was going insane. I thought I was imagining things. But how could I explain this? How could I explain the feeling in my chest, the cold breath on the back of my neck, the voice in my ear that had whispered my name in the dark? You want to know who I am? Where I've been all this time? You already know. You just don't want to admit it. But soon, you will. Soon, you'll understand. I'm not leaving. The letter ended there, but the weight of those words pressed down on me like a heavy stone. I was paralyzed with fear. And worse, the letter had been in my apartment while I slept. There was no way anyone had entered. I had checked everything before going to bed. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, whatever this person, thing was, it wasn't just following me. It was in my life. It was watching me, waiting for me to figure it out. But what did it want from me? Why was it doing this? And who or what was sending these letters? That night, I decided to take action. I wasn't going to sit back and let this thing continue to torment me. I had to find out who or what was behind this. I waited until midnight. I left my apartment with the door slightly ajar, my heart pounding in my chest. Every nerve was on edge. I was determined to find answers. I walked the streets of my neighborhood, keeping to the shadows, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone following me. But there was no one. The streets were empty, and the silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. But then I heard it. A soft, slow tap. 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 It echoed through the street, coming from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but again, nothing. I walked faster, almost running now, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tap grew louder, closer, until I could hear it right behind me, matching my every step. Then, a whisper. You can't escape me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I ran, my feet pounding the pavement, my breath ragged and sharp in my chest. The whisper followed me, soft at first, but then growing louder, clearer, until it was almost like the words were being spoken directly in my ear. You can't outrun me. I pushed myself harder, faster, until my lungs burned and the cold air stung my skin. The streetlights above flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to reach toward me, stretching and pulling as if they were alive, desperate to grasp me, to hold me in place. The whisper followed me relentlessly, like a shadow. I turned down an alley, hoping the darkness would hide me, that the narrow walls might offer some protection. But the alley seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. Every corner I rounded felt like I was heading deeper into a maze that had no exit. The tapping was louder now. It was no longer just behind me, it was everywhere. In front of me. Beside me. Beneath me. You can't escape the truth, the voice said. It's always been here. I stumbled, my legs trembling, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But everything felt too real. The cold, the shadows, the voice, everything was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my chest heaving. I could hear the soft rustle of paper in the distance. The sound of it was unmistakable, like someone flipping through a stack of letters. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the alley, standing under the flickering streetlight, was a figure. A silhouette. The figure was unnaturally still, like a statue, unmoving in the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague outline of a person standing there as if they had been waiting for me. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as my eyes locked on the figure. Was it real? Was this the person behind the letters? The one who had been watching me, following me? The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence, heavy and suffocating. It was like it was watching me from every angle, not just physically, but deep within my mind. I could almost hear it breathing, its thoughts intertwining with mine, wrapping around me like a suffocating thread. And then, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, cold, and unmistakable. You've been searching for answers, haven't you? You've been trying to figure out who I am. You should have known the answer all along. I couldn't move. The words seemed to paralyze me, their weight sinking into my bones. You've been running from yourself. And then, I understood. A chill ran down my spine as the truth hit me like a slap to the face. This wasn't some stranger. This wasn't someone following me, watching me from afar. This was me. The figure under the streetlight slowly began to step forward, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was me. A distorted version of myself, wearing a cold, hollow expression, eyes empty and black as if they had been drained of life. Its mouth curled into a twisted smile, a smile that didn't belong. I've been with you all this time, it said, its voice mirroring my own, but deeper, colder. You never noticed, did you? How could you? You've been too busy running from the truth. But it's time for you to face it. I took a step back, my body shaking uncontrollably. How could this be happening? How could I be standing there, facing myself, but not truly me? It was a nightmarish reflection, twisted and broken, like something that had crawled out of the darkest corner of my mind. The air around me grew colder, the shadows darker. The figure took another step, and then another, until it was standing right in front of me, its cold eyes boring into mine. The letter, it whispered, wasn't written by anyone else. It was written by you. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. The letter, the voice, the presence that had followed me, it was all part of me. A part of myself I had tried to bury, to forget. But it had never truly gone away. It had been watching me, waiting for me to confront it. "You can't escape what you are," the figure said, its voice like ice. "The past, the future, it's all the same. You've always known the truth." I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my mind reeling. It couldn't be true. But deep down, I knew it was. I had been living with this darkness inside me for as long as I could remember. And now it was coming to claim me. The figure reached out, its hand cold and lifeless, and as it touched my arm, a jolt of cold electricity shot through me, freezing me in place. "You are me," it said. "And now, I am you." Everything went black. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow on the familiar surroundings. But everything felt different. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken presence that I couldn't shake. I glanced around, my heart pounding, but everything seemed normal. The same as it had always been. The same apartment, the same routine. But the letter was still there, sitting on the counter. This time, it was addressed to someone else. And I knew, deep down, that it would never stop. The cycle had begun. I sat in the silence of my apartment, the letter still sitting there on the counter. It was as though everything had returned to normal, but the weight in the air told me otherwise. The letter addressed to someone else, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign. A continuation of something that had never truly ended. I tried to shake the feeling, the unease that was crawling under my skin. I picked up my phone, hoping for some distraction, but the screen was blank. No messages, no notifications, no signs of life from anyone. It was as if I was alone in a world that had forgotten me. Except for the letter. It seemed to stare at me, its presence like a constant reminder of what had happened. What I had discovered. I wanted to ignore it, to push it away, but my fingers betrayed me. They reached for it, slowly, as if they had a mind of their own. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The paper inside was crinkled, old, the edges slightly torn as though it had been handled far too many times. The handwriting was the same as before, familiar, yet unfamiliar. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault. But it's time to face the consequences." The words sent a shiver down my spine. What consequences? What was I supposed to face? Was it something from my past, or something that was yet to come? As I read, the letters seemed to grow longer, the words shifting, as if they were rearranging themselves right in front of my eyes. "You've always known. You can feel it, can't you? It's inside you, and it's waiting to take over. There's nowhere left to run." I blinked, trying to clear my mind, but the words were getting more intense, more personal. My heartbeat quickened as the letter continued. "The truth is not something you can ignore. It's time to remember. To remember everything you've buried." I dropped the letter. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stared at the words on the paper. A flood of memories began to crash into me, memories I had forgotten, buried deep within myself. Memories of things I'd seen but never understood. And then I remembered. A place. A face. A feeling. The figure. The one who had been following me, watching me, talking to me. I hadn't run from it. I had tried to run from myself. But the truth was that I couldn't escape it. I was the one who had written the letter. I was the one who had been leaving clues for myself, pushing myself toward this moment. You're not alone. The words from the letter echoed in my mind. You never were. Suddenly, the silence in my apartment felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing thicker. I turned toward the window, hoping the daylight would offer some comfort, but the street outside was empty. The world outside had fallen silent, as though holding its breath. And then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps. A slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the room. They were too close. Too real. I turned sharply, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. No one was there. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting louder, coming closer, as if someone was moving through the very walls. My eyes darted to the door, but it remained still, locked, untouched. The footsteps moved around the room, circling me, as though the very space itself was alive, watching me. And then, a voice. Not the voice from the letter, but something else, closer, more personal. It's time to wake up. I spun around, searching for the source, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Heavier. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something unnatural. I backed away from the door, my legs weak. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything fell silent. The footsteps, the voice, the air, they were all gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The letter was still on the counter, its words etched into my mind, and I understood now. I wasn't just being watched. I was being led somewhere. And I had no choice but to follow. The next morning, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had crossed a line, that the world I knew had shifted just beyond my reach. I had seen things, heard things, but nothing felt real anymore. There was a shadow over everything, a weight on my chest that I couldn't shake. The letter had been the catalyst, the first piece in a puzzle I couldn't complete. But I knew the answers were out there. Somewhere. And I had to find them. I walked out of my apartment, the world outside seeming eerily normal. The traffic hummed by, the people moved in their usual rush, and yet everything felt wrong. I felt as though I was walking through a dream where nothing made sense and every step only led me deeper into the unknown. I passed a park, the same park I had walked through countless times before, but today it felt different. The air was colder, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was observing my every move. I stopped near the bench where I had first seen the figure, the one that had started all of this. The place was empty, just as it had been the last few days. But there, on the bench, was something new. A small envelope, tucked into the crack of the seat, its seal unbroken. And once again, it was addressed to me. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper felt old, as though it had been waiting for me for a long time. I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest, and inside, I found the final message. It's too late now. You've already crossed the line. I looked around, but there was no one. No one but me. And then, the footsteps began again. The footsteps echoed in the distance, getting louder with each passing second. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the envelope in my hand, as though it held the key to everything, or perhaps the key to my undoing. I glanced around the park again. The trees seemed darker, more ominous than I remembered. The shadows stretched across the ground, curling like fingers that reached toward me. The park had always been a quiet place, a sanctuary, but today it felt like a stage for something much darker. The footsteps were closer now, too close. My breath caught in my throat as I looked over my shoulder, but again, no one was there. The park was empty. Yet the sound persisted, like someone was walking just behind me, only out of sight. I turned back toward the bench, clutching the envelope, desperate to make sense of what was happening. The world felt like it was slipping away, like I was falling through cracks in reality, unable to hold on to anything solid. It's too late now. You've already crossed the line. The words from the letter played in my mind over and over, like an incantation that refused to leave. I felt a presence behind me, close now, too close. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it. The air shifted. It was as though the very space around me had changed. The footsteps stopped. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I needed to get out of there, away from this strange, suffocating feeling that was closing in on me. But before I could move, I heard a voice, quiet, almost a whisper, but clear. "You know who I am." I froze. That voice. It was familiar, yet I couldn't place it. It seemed to echo inside my mind, sending a wave of unease through me. I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the details, the posture, the clothes, the way the figure was standing so unnervingly still. It was as though it had always been there, lurking just out of sight. My mouth went dry as I realized it was me. Not exactly me, but something like me. The same height, the same build, the same face, but the eyes were wrong. They were hollow, empty, like there was nothing behind them. Just a void staring back at me. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing at the edge of the park, no longer near the bench. The figure was gone. The footsteps were silent. The envelope had disappeared, too. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? A trick of my mind? I couldn't be sure. My hands were trembling, and I could still feel the lingering weight of the letter in my mind. I turned and walked toward the street, my footsteps echoing in the empty park. I had to get away. I had to leave. But the thought of the figure, my reflection, kept gnawing at me. What had I seen? What had happened to me? A sense of finality washed over me. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was someone out there that had been watching me for a long time. And now, it seemed, the watching had stopped. The waiting was over. I wasn't sure if I would ever escape it. But I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I had been found. Have you ever looked at something so ordinary, and wondered if it was truly what it seemed? What if the reflection you see in a puddle isn't just the image of the world above, but something far darker, something that isn't supposed to be there? I first noticed a puddle 2 days ago, just after the rain had stopped. It was a strange thing, really, appearing right in the middle of my backyard. My yard isn't exactly spacious, but it's enough to let me breathe, enough to make it feel like home. That puddle shouldn't have existed, not after the rain stopped. The sun came up quickly, drying everything else, but this one stayed, glistening on the ground, like some kind of invitation I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just a little deeper than usual. I walked past it on my way to the shed, focused on the tasks I had in mind, but something made me pause. The puddle hadn't shrunk at all. It was still there, even in the hot, dry weather that followed the rain. I tried to ignore it the next day, but again, it was there, stubborn as ever, undisturbed by the scorching sun. I leaned closer to inspect it, thinking maybe there was something wrong with the ground. Maybe the soil underneath it had shifted in some way, trapping the water. But no matter how much I examined it, nothing about the puddle made sense. And then it happened. I was standing at the edge of the puddle, lost in thought, when I noticed something strange in the reflection. At first, it was so subtle, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The image in the puddle wasn't just the usual mirrored sky and trees. There, staring up at me, was a face. A man's face. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back quickly, blinking, trying to clear my vision. I told myself it was nothing, just a play of light or some trick of the water. But when I looked again, the face was still there. The man's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to stare directly at me, and there was something unnerving about them, something wrong. I glanced around, but the yard was empty. No one was there, no one had been. But the face in the puddle, it didn't disappear. It stayed there, unmoving, as if it were waiting. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but my curiosity overpowered the fear gnawing at me. I crouched down, peering into the puddle, trying to understand what was happening. The face didn't shift, it didn't move, but I felt as though it was watching me closely. Its features were blurred around the edges, as if the reflection was being distorted by something beneath the water's surface. I reached out a hand, hesitating just above the puddle. I didn't know why, but I couldn't pull myself away. It was as if something was calling to me from the other side. Suddenly, the face smiled. The smile wasn't a friendly one, it was wide, stretching unnaturally, exposing teeth that didn't seem quite right. I froze, my hand trembling in the air, just inches from the water. The reflection shifted again, and the man's face moved closer, the outline of his features warping as if he was rising from the depths, coming closer to me. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. I stepped back, heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The man's face lingered in the water, watching me. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw his eyes move, as if he were no longer trapped in the puddle, but instead was trying to reach out to me. Something deep within me screamed that I should run, that I shouldn't be here. But the man's gaze held me captive. I stood there, paralyzed, as the world around me seemed to blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that puddle was no longer confined to it. Something was beginning to stir beneath the surface. The air felt thick, as though it had shifted, pressing down on me with an unseen weight. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place. The puddle, once just a harmless pool of rainwater, now seemed like a dark portal to something else, something far more sinister. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I tore my gaze away from the reflection, stepping back, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the yard, searching for any sign of something, anything familiar. But all I could see was the empty space, the trees swaying in the wind, and the sun shining brightly above. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I glanced at the puddle again. The man's face was gone. The water looked calm, undisturbed. But I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me to return. I tried to walk away, to leave the yard and forget about the puddle entirely, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. It was as though the puddle had some kind of power over me, drawing me back with an invisible force. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. It couldn't have been real, could it? A trick of the light, the reflection of a nearby tree or a cloud? No. It had felt too real, too alive. I turned, taking a few shaky steps toward the door, but as I did, I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from behind me. It was the faintest of noises, almost imperceptible, like someone brushing against the grass. I spun around, my pulse quickening. The puddle was still there, calm as ever, but something was different. The reflection in the puddle was no longer just the sky and trees. The man's face had returned, but this time he wasn't just looking up at me. His eyes were wide, as if he were seeing something behind me, something he wanted me to see too. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out of my skin. Slowly, I turned my head, my body trembling with fear. Nothing. The yard was empty, just as it had been moments before. No one was there. But as I looked back at the puddle, I saw something new, a shadow moving beneath the water's surface, shifting and rippling, like something was swimming just below. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow moved closer to the surface, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure. It was long, distorted, and it seemed to be reaching up toward the edge of the puddle, its fingers stretching, desperate to break free. I stumbled back, my body finally obeying the instinct to run. But as I turned to flee, I heard something else, something soft, like a whisper, coming from the puddle. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, a voice, deep and hollow, almost like a low growl. "Come closer." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was calling to me, pulling at something inside me, urging me to come back. I shook my head, my mind screaming at me to stay away, to get inside and lock the door. But my feet refused to move. I felt like I was being held in place by some invisible force. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my chest tightening, as though something was pressing down on me. And then, through the water, I saw it, a figure, slowly rising from the puddle. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it emerged, I could see more clearly. The man's face, distorted and twisted, was no longer just a reflection. He was standing there, in the puddle, his body emerging from the water like a specter. His eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were locked on mine, and his smile, it was too wide, too sharp. His mouth stretched unnaturally, and I could see his teeth, jagged and sharp, glinting in the light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey me. The puddle had become a doorway, and the man, or whatever he was coming through. The sound of his laughter echoed in my mind, low and guttural, like a deep rumble of thunder. My pulse raced, my mind spinning, trying to process what was happening. Was this real? Was I dreaming? I could barely think, the fear overwhelming me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The puddle was calm once more, the reflection of the trees and sky now untouched. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. But eventually, my legs found the strength to move. I turned and fled inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and backed away slowly, my heart still racing. I thought I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the puddle was still out there, waiting for me to return. And deep down, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the events of the yard over and over, each time with a new layer of dread. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that I had imagined everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made me jump. I tried to focus on the hum of the streetlight outside my window, the usual sounds that once calmed me, but now they felt foreign, dangerous. The silence between them was filled with a heavy weight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his cold, hollow eyes staring at me from beneath the water's surface. I didn't know what to do. Should I go back to the puddle? Should I try to confront whatever it was that had been lurking there, trying to pull me in? Or should I just ignore it, pretend like nothing had happened, and hope it would go away? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if every moment, every step I took, was being tracked. My heart would race whenever I walked past a window or even glanced outside, half expecting to see the puddle still there, waiting. I thought about calling someone, my friends, maybe the police, but I couldn't explain what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? A man in a puddle reaching out to me? It sounded insane, even to my own ears. The next morning, I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, and the air still held the dampness of the night before. I hesitated by the door, staring at the yard through the glass. The puddle was gone. It shouldn't have felt like a relief, but it did. Maybe it had been a figment of my imagination. Maybe my mind had just played tricks on me. I let out a shaky breath, but as I turned to go back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the window, I saw the puddle again, as if it had never disappeared. But it wasn't just the puddle. There, standing in front of it, was the figure. The man. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples as my eyes locked onto the reflection. He wasn't just standing there anymore, he was closer. His body was emerging from the puddle, his hands, his long, twisted fingers, gripping the edge, pulling himself up. But this time, I noticed something new. His reflection didn't match the yard around me. The colors were off, distorted. The sky above him was dark, stormy, like something out of a nightmare. And his face, it was smiling. That same twisted, jagged smile that stretched too wide, too sharp. I backed away from the window, my legs weak beneath me. I stumbled, nearly tripping over the furniture as I turned toward the door. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it get closer. But just as I reached for the handle, a sound froze me in place. A soft tap. Then another. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. The tapping was coming from the window. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I didn't need to hear it twice. It was the figure, his long fingers pressing against the glass, his face now inches from mine, his eyes wide with hunger. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I ran, not looking back, not daring to see if it was still following me. I burst through the door and into the street, the cool morning air hitting my face like a slap, but it didn't make me feel better. The weight of the thing in my mind was heavier than ever. I could still feel its eyes on me, still hear the sound of its wet footsteps following, getting closer, no matter how fast I ran. And that's when I realized it wasn't the puddle anymore. It was inside me. The thing had followed me, had found its way into my thoughts, into my fears. The longer I ran, the more it felt like I couldn't escape, like it was coming from every corner of the world. Every shadow, every reflection. I needed help, but I knew no one would believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? How could they stop something that lived in the water? Something that could reach out from every reflective surface? I stopped in the middle of the street, gasping for breath. There was only one thing left to do. I had to face it. I had to go back. I had to return to the puddle. The decision settled on me like a weight I couldn't escape. My body trembled with fear, but it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal. A pull I couldn't resist. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of returning to the yard, to that puddle, filled me with a suffocating dread. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to keep me away. But I kept moving, driven by something I couldn't explain, curiosity, terror, or maybe both. When I reached the gate, I hesitated. I looked around, half expecting to see something in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty street. The quiet made everything seem more ominous. The normal hum of life, of birds chirping or dogs barking, was gone. The world felt too still. I pushed open the gate and walked toward the spot where the puddle had been. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. It was still there, exactly where it had been before. But it looked different now. It wasn't just a simple puddle anymore. The edges were darker, almost like they were crawling up the ground, seeping into the earth around it. The water was no longer clear. It had a thick, murky quality to it, like something was stirring beneath the surface, something waiting. I took a step closer, my eyes fixed on the water. It rippled slightly, though there was no wind. The image of the man didn't appear immediately, but I knew he was there. I could feel him, as if he was just beneath the surface, watching me, waiting. I knelt down, my hands shaking, and I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the water. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the water began to move on its own. The ripples spread wider, the surface churning as though something was emerging from the depths. And then, I saw it. The face. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The man was there, staring at me through the murky water, his expression twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on me. His lips curled, stretching into that horrible, unnatural grin. I froze, unable to look away. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, but the man's gaze never wavered. The longer I stared at him, the more I felt myself drawn in, as if the water was pulling me closer, as if his eyes were some sort of invisible tether. "Come closer," the voice echoed in my mind, smooth and chilling, though his lips didn't move. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was something deeper, a feeling that crawled into my thoughts. "I know you want to." I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed, my hand hovering just above the water. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could feel the ground beneath me begin to vibrate, as though the very earth was shifting with the weight of whatever this thing was. The man in the puddle leaned forward, his face distorting further, stretching out of shape in unnatural angles. The water bubbled and hissed as though something in it was alive, something dangerous, something desperate. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "I can give you everything. All you need to do is let go." I couldn't look away. My heart raced, my skin tingled with the coldness of his voice, and something deep inside me urged me to step forward, to cross the line. The edge of the puddle beckoned like a threshold to another world. But then, a sound broke through the trance. A car passed by, the tires screeching on the wet road, and I snapped back to reality. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my hands trembling as I wiped my face as if to shake off the lingering sensation of the man's presence. The puddle remained still, unremarkable in its simplicity, just a patch of water on the ground. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was a mess of confusion, of fear, and a strange sense of loss. I had almost given in. I had almost let it pull me in. But I knew now that I couldn't ignore it. The man, or whatever he was, wasn't just in the puddle. He was in me too. The pull wasn't over, and I had no idea how to stop it. And as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the puddle. My own face, staring back at me, blank, empty, and eerily still. The world around me seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was looking into the reflection of the puddle or if I had become the reflection. That's when I heard it again. The whisper. Come closer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the puddle. My heart hammered in my chest as the whisper echoed in my mind, soft yet insistent. The air around me felt thick, as though every breath was harder to take. The world was closing in, and I couldn't understand where the boundaries of reality ended and where the darkness began. I turned quickly, stumbling away from the puddle, trying to escape the grip it had on me. My shoes slapped against the wet pavement as I ran, but it didn't feel like I was moving fast enough. I could still hear that whisper, floating in the air, as if the puddle had infected the very atmosphere around me. The pull, like an invisible string, tugged at the core of me, unwilling to let go. I reached my front door, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking too badly to find the right one. Finally, I managed to unlock it, bursting inside and slamming the door shut behind me. The house was silent, too quiet, as though it was holding its breath along with me. I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself, the image of the man's eyes burning in my mind. I had to be imagining it. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The puddle had changed something in me. The world felt warped, like the edges of reality were fraying, and the man in the water was somehow part of that. I glanced toward the kitchen window. The faint light of dusk was creeping in, casting long shadows over the yard. My pulse quickened again, that familiar sense of dread creeping back in. I wasn't safe. I hadn't escaped it. And then I saw it. A reflection. It was in the window. Not outside, not in the yard, but in the glass itself, as though the window had become another kind of mirror. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't my face. The eyes were different. Hollow. Empty. The man. I gasped and staggered back, falling onto the couch. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. Was I losing my mind? I couldn't stop shaking. I had to make sense of this. I had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. My mind raced through every possibility, but the answers I came up with only made it worse. Maybe the puddle wasn't just a reflection of the man, it was a gateway. A place where something could reach through and pull you into another world, another existence, one that wasn't quite human. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A cold draft swept through the room. The temperature dropped, and I shivered uncontrollably. My skin tingled, and I felt that pull again. I stood up, my heart racing. No. No, no, no. I whispered, backing away from the window. The air around me grew thicker. The sound of water trickling began to fill the room, soft but persistent, like the sound of a stream running just outside. But there was no stream, no water anywhere. I moved to the front door, desperate to escape, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. The door wouldn't budge. It felt locked, but I had just come through it. My fingers scrabbled at the doorknob, slick with sweat. The pressure in my chest grew, suffocating. And then I heard it again. The whisper. Come closer. I turned, my eyes wide in panic. The walls of the living room seemed to stretch, bending, warping. The edges of the room blurred. It was as though the house itself was being consumed by the same thing that had claimed the puddle, as though the space around me was merging with something darker, something that didn't belong. The man's face appeared in the corner of my vision, hovering in the air, his features distorted, but still unmistakable. He was getting closer. No. No, please. Not again, I begged, my voice breaking. I ran to the kitchen, stumbling through the hallway, anything to get away from the suffocating presence that seemed to be pulling me toward it. But as I reached the back door, the same cold feeling wrapped around me. My reflection stared back at me in the window, and the whisper became louder, clearer. Come closer. It's almost time. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't care. I just needed to escape. I needed to be anywhere else. But as I turned to flee, the lights flickered again. And this time, they didn't return. The house went dark. In the silence, I felt it, the water, the dampness, the cold seep into my bones. The puddle was inside the house now. I could feel it. The pull was too strong to fight, too powerful to ignore. The door slammed shut behind me, and I realized with sudden clarity I wasn't running anymore. I had already crossed the threshold. The man in the puddle wasn't just a reflection. He was real, and he was waiting for me. And I was about to meet him face to face. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.